Thank you very much, Sophie, and good evening, everyone. Warm welcome to Cardiff University and to this lecture. It's my pleasure to have the job of introducing tonight's speaker, Professor Mona Siddiqui. Professor Siddiqui was born in Karachi, but at the age of 5, she and her family migrated to England, and she grew up predominantly in Huddersfield in West Yorkshire. And she's, of course, an academic. She is currently at the University of Edinburgh's School of Divinity. She went to Edinburgh just over 2 years ago to become the first Muslim professor in Islamic and Interreligious studies. But before that, she was Professor of Islamic Studies at Glasgow University, where she directed the Centre for the Study of Islam. And Professor Siddiqui has a very impressive record of publications, amongst which are Christians, Muslims and Jesus, Yale University Press, 2013, The Good Muslim, Reflections on Classical Islamic Law and Theology, Cambridge University Press, 2012, The Routledge Reader in Christian-Muslim Relations, also 2012, and How to Read the Quran, Granta, 2007. And an account of her own personal and theological journey between faith and freedom will shortly be published by IB Taurus. Now, Professor Siddiqui has visiting or associate professorial posts at universities in Utrecht, in Tilburg, Georgetown and Cambridge, and has no fewer than 3 honorary doctorates. She is, of course, a very well-known public commentator on radio, television, in the newspaper press. She chairs the BBC's Religious Advisory Committee. She regularly contributes to BBC Radio 4's Thought for the Day. And in 2012, she appeared on Desert Island Discs, where her choices included, and I hope I don't embarrass you with these now, LOVE by Nat King Cole and Red Red Wine by UB40. And her luxury to take to the desert island was tea with milk and sugar. You can tell that I've done my research. Thank you, BBC iPlayer. Professor Siddiqui is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, of the Royal Society of Arts, and in 2011 was awarded an OBE for her contribution to interfaith services. This evening's lecture is entitled Friendship and Hospitality, Challenge or Route to Integration. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mona Siddiqui.
I chose the topic of friendship and hospitality as part of the overall theme of this lecture series, which looks at Muslims and Islam in Britain. But I'm not speaking as a sociologist or as someone who has spent her time trying to understand the nuances between words like integration and assimilation, especially when it comes to minority communities. I am, as Chris has pointed out, a British Muslim by faith and nationality, an academic by profession, and I suppose split between being a legal ethicist and a theologian through the disciplines of my research. So really many of the comments here will incorporate all 3 aspects of my life. My main hypothesis here is that it seems to me that when we dispense with all the political narratives about the success, failure, or impasse of multiculturalism, we may be left with a simpler and more basic understanding about the theological, even practical challenges as to why so many Muslim communities in the UK and in Western Europe are regarded as a problem when it comes to the issue of concepts like integration. And just a short anecdote here, many years ago, a very respectable and respected newspaper editor, a national newspaper, said to me, the problem with integrating with Muslims is that you never meet them in the pub. And he wasn't actually being facetious. He was trying to point out, where do you meet Muslims, where the most common way of socializing in the UK seems to be gatherings at the pub. But what he said made me think of the whole issue of socializing and why friendship in this socializing, and why human interactions are so important when we think outside the political issues around integration. And part of the problem is a socio-political vocabulary of our day. A word such as integration cannot really have an absolute definition, and so constantly struggles to set benchmarks for failure or success when it comes to minority communities, even if they see themselves as British first. And for me personally, I would begin with a sense of individual belonging. Whether multiculturalism, however defined, has failed or reached an impasse, it has led to a renewed interest in the question of citizenship. On a personal note, I strongly believe that there is a difference between being a citizen and being a good citizen, and that actually the state itself may have very little to do with the option I choose. Despite its primacy as a fundamental political structure in society and its vast reach, the state remains limited in scope and operation in regard to the dynamics of social relations. Citizenship is not simply having the right to be protected, or having the right passport, or being able to vote and not break the law. Rather, to feel a true citizen, a fundamental requirement is a sense of belonging. I need to feel that I belong to a place, and without this sense of belonging, notwithstanding cultural and religious differences, I will remain a passive citizen rather than an actively engaged person with the moral impulse to participate in society. Citizenship must always remain visionary and proactive for the good of all society. It is this kind of citizenship which Jürgen Habermas says demands a more costly commitment and motivation, and these cannot simply be imposed by the law. Firstly, citizenship cannot develop in isolation. It demands relationships with civic institutions and relations with people. By its very nature, citizenship is relational. When I look back to my own upbringing, growing up as an Indian Pakistani Muslim in the UK, my first relationship with anyone outside my immediate family was through friendship. My social milieu was made up of British people, largely of non-Muslim origin, and even though my parents socialized mainly with other Muslim families whose children were our peers. My parents' friends were people with whom they shared religion, culture, and language. My close friends were people whom I didn't share any of these commonalities. My friends were people with whom I went to school, college, and then university. And today, in my professional context, my friends are still largely from non-Muslim backgrounds. I haven't sought this deliberately, and while I fully appreciate that differences of race, gender, or religion can matter, the value of good friendships can affect us in different ways at different stages of our lives. For me, religion and background never mattered. The most important aspect of a close friendship was intellectual intimacy. Indeed, in my professional and personal life, I realized that intellectual intimacy, which is built largely on the gradual disclosure of one's thinking and views on a range of subjects, lies at the basis of the most profound friendships, where differences of race, gender, or religion could not become obstructions to forming meaningful relationships. I felt compelled to examine this issue through my own experience of forming friendships with a whole variety of people to whom I feel connected largely because I have grown up in the liberal social milieu of a Western society. That emotional connection has also led to a cultural connection. Here I've enjoyed the freedom to resist the more rigorous conceptions of some Muslim communities that Muslims should not be friends with non-Muslims, that religion should retain its primacy in forming relationships. So I see my own freedom as a privilege because it's not universal. Not everyone encourages this kind of freedom, and not every society is built up in a way where this kind of pluralism, this fluidity, is seen as a moral virtue. I'm convinced that if anything, my own identity has been formed and strengthened by some of the soul-searching I have done with and over my friends. And today, my children's friendships with boys and girls of various backgrounds has prompted me to think on the very nature of friendship and how it shapes who we are as children and who we are as adults. It's true to say my children enjoy an even greater freedom, and their friendships have made them more open, generous, far more sympathetic young citizens, and prompts me to think of my own life, those who came and those who went. We are all influenced in all kinds of ways by those who touch our lives and those whom we allow to stay in our lives. As François Mauriac said, No love, no friendship can cross the path of our destiny without leaving some mark on it forever. I would argue that friendship is probably the defining relationship of the modern age, in showing us that we are not solitary but relational beings. But friendship also involves risk and can take us away from the comfort of religious and psychological convictions, for it involves making choices about relationships and often staring at life's uncertainties and ambiguities. Friendships demand that we evaluate who we are as people and how and in whom we seek happiness and wisdom. The American writer Paul Waddell was right when he said that so much of our lives is a history of our friendships. For the ancients, friendship is the first law of community, without which justice between communities would be difficult. Friendship is an ingredient to the moral life, the life of a civic community. And there are few phrases more often repeated in literature on friendship than Aristotle's claim that friendship is a kind of excellence or goes along with excellence, and furthermore, is very necessary for living. For no one would choose to live without friends, even if he had all the other good things in life. Aristotle's argument is that virtue is essential to a good life, and we cannot be good by ourselves or in solitude. We need friends to know ourselves and to do good in life, for the moral life is what happens to us in relation to others. Cultivating meaningful friendships has an immensely powerful social worth, and I think is essential to the good society, to human flourishing. The classical philosophers knew this. They regarded friendship as the most important ingredient of a worthwhile and happy life, essential to creating a good society. The Roman orator Cicero saw friendship as existing only between good people, people who cultivated virtue, which he said is the greatest of all things. And for Cicero, friendship was what made life worth living. Despite the relevance of friendship to the quality and meaning of our lives, only a small number of philosophers and theologians have written on the subject of friendship at any length. In contrasting the prominence of friendship in Greek philosophy and moral thought to its relative neglect in modern philosophy, Hans Gadamer claimed that because friendship is not a value or belief, it does not fit easily within modern thought, largely premised on a self-conscious modern subject. For Gadamer, friendship is a good rather than a value. Friendship was always important for sociological and political reasons, and I feel that today, when so many of us think of friendship as a personal and private matter, we need to re-emphasize the social aspect of friendship for the future well-being of our diverse societies. From a religious perspective, there seems to be no dominant narrative on friendship, nor is Scripture itself particularly concerned with the way friendship is essential to our humanity. If anything, friendship is about preferential and selective love, whereas most scriptural traditions extol the universality of love and the relationship of love between human beings and God. Agape, the distinctive Christian love, demands that we love our enemy even though we know there is no reciprocity to this love. Again, Paul Waddell compares the relationship of friendship with Christian love. Friendship is a necessary good in any life, but it is not a specific good. It is a powerful love, but it is not the love by which we imitate Christ. Given the relationship between agape and philia, to begin to be friends is not to begin to be Christian. Friendship is one life, agape is another life. Friendship is good love, but it is not redemptive love, and that explains why the relationship between philia and agape, even if not unalterably conflictual, is unalterably strained. He himself criticized the arguments of those who say that friendship and Christian love are opposed by examining the writings of Søren Kierkegaard and Anders Nygren. Kierkegaard displayed more nuance in his later writings, but both writers saw the Christian agape as a distinctive Christian love, which taught love for all, in which there were no outsiders. This was in contrast to friendship, which was viewed as preferential and exclusionary, and could even be selfish. Waddell also recognizes the compelling nature of this argument. In his recent work on love, the Catholic theologian Werner Joron writes about the ambiguity and at times sectarian tendencies which are also part of the Christian story of love. The discourse in John, he says, on love centers on a particular Christian community's own inner life, including the call to pay attention to those brothers who require help and assistance. The equality of the male members of the Christian community may thus be stressed, but the shift from a love that is actively concerned about all the others now to a love that is primarily directed towards the inner circle of a particular Christian church cannot be now overlooked. In this community, love functions first of all in terms of internal loyalty over against a societal context, experienced as threatening. The fact that John's community celebrates God's overall love for the world in the sending of the Son should not mask this narrowing of the community's overall horizon. While Christian perspectives on biblical love show some of the tensions around love and friendship, from a Quranic perspective also, friendship is envisaged largely through the spectrum of right belief and the right kind of alliances. The Quran contains around 40 verses referring to some form of friendship, which may or may not correspond to the definition of a friend in Western philosophy. But there is little exploration of this theme outside of adab literature. Scriptural texts do not offer any kind of treatise on friendship, as one often finds in philosophical and other writings, other than to warn against hypocrisy and deception through association with false or unbelieving friends. Friendship is not discussed in any explicit way in the Quran, though the words wali, khalil, and sadiq all correspond to the English word friend. In the Quran, friendship and social ties are envisaged largely within the theme of forging alliances. These alliances can be on the human plane, between individuals, politically between communities, or between human beings and God. In the former context, the Quran's reference to friends in whom the fledgling Muslim community looks to as becoming allies of the new faith. The Quran repeatedly advises against forming bonds of protection or alliance with those who are not from this new category of believers. This category of people can exist of Jews and Christians, albeit these verses must be read in their historical contexts. For example, Quran 5:51, O you who believe, do not take the Jews and the Christians as protectors. They are protectors only to each other. Anyone who takes them as allies becomes one of them. God does not guide such wrongdoers. The Quran also stresses the wrongs of making alliances with those who ridicule the Prophet's message. O you who believe, do not take as allies, brackets friends, those who ridicule your religion and make fun of it, whether people who were given the scripture before you or believers. In fact, the Quran uses the word bitana, that which is inside. In Ibn Kathir's tafsir, bitana refers to a friend with whom one shares secrets, and such friendship can only be had with those who accepted Islam. The believer is commanded not to seek friendship or take as advisors those who are non-Muslims, as they will only have hostility towards the new Muslims. In the Quran, God is a friend of the believer, and the believers are friends amongst themselves. Their friendship, however, should not be construed as a passive state of being. The alliance and friendship between believers is expressed through enjoining the right and forbidding the wrong, Quran 9:71. A consistent theme of the Quran is that those who become friends and protectors of each other are active members of the community. Verses of this sentiment appear in several places in the Quran. What is desirable is cultivating relations with those who share the new prophetic vision. What is dangerous is allying oneself with those who oppose or are actively hostile to this emerging faith. But scholars have argued that the Prophet himself made alliances and bonds of trust with certain polytheists. The verses which prohibit alliances refer only to those non-Muslims who fight Muslims or are engaged in hostility with them. The Quranic verses on friendship vary in tone, but often stress the futility of seeking any alliances with anyone other than God, who is our only protector and helper. The Quran talks of God as the helper, the Nasir, or the friend, the Wali. Unto God belong the dominions of the heaven and the earth. He gives life and he takes life. Except for him, we have no protector nor helper. So that true friendship may lie with God alone, as only God himself is the true friend. Friendship must be sought for God and rooted in God, and for the new community which is commanded to submit to God. One might be tempted to argue that religious faith places a distinct value on particular friendships where God is not just present, but God is a focus. Taking God as a friend is a broad and inclusive concept and should be furthered today in our pluralist societies. The classical conceptual framework of enemy and friend no longer exists, either politically or theologically. From the religious perspective, society becomes divided between those who believe and those who do not believe, for all kinds of political, religious, and social reasons, where friendship is encouraged with the former group, but not the latter. But it seems to me that if most religions stress the universal brotherhood of all and affection for other fellow beings, where are the theological limits to our understanding of truth and community? Friendship has to be interpreted in more human ways than simply through the political framework of seeing people as either allies or enemies, or as believers and non-believers. Even when we explore the vast literature of Islamic law, we find that though Islamic law regulates many different kinds of relationships, it does not deal systematically with friendship or typologies of friendship. The relationship between husband and wife, parents and children, masters and slaves, believers and non-believers are just examples of human ties and bonds which are assessed in legal language, where the classical texts deal with social, political, moral and financial obligations between the individuals. Friendship, however, does not come under scrutiny in the examination of private or civic life. One could argue that friendship is one area of human relationships which has been given little systematic discussion in pre-modern Islamic legal and theological texts. This is not to say that it hasn't been analysed, especially in adab literature. The 9th century teacher and philologist Ibn Qutayba devoted a whole book to friendship in his encyclopedia, the Book of Choice Narratives. In a similar type of work, the 10th century Andalusian scholar Abdul Rabi of Cordova wrote the sophisticated treatise of the unique necklace, but even that contains only one specific reference to friendship. But more systematic and philosophical accounts of friendship in the pre-modern period are rare. One such account can be found in Mishkawi's 10th century work, Tahdhib al-Akhlaq. Mishkawi's treatise on philosophical ethics is one of the most influential and important books on Islamic ethics. It contains 6 discourses, of which the 5th one is on love and friendship. He writes that the human goal should be to perfect and refine individual character. He dwells both on the different kinds of love between people and the various forms of friendship in just one discourse. For Mishkawi, justice and just relations are at the core of the ideal society. If people are just towards themselves, they will be just towards others, not just towards friends and relatives, but towards those who are remote as well. But justice is an essential component of the good society, mainly because citizens do not love each other. If citizens loved each other, then they would act with benevolence. It is on the note of love where he ends his discourse on love and begins on justice. He begins by stating that there is no way for a single individual to become complete by themselves, and that as individuals, each of us finds completion only in a relationship, only in our friends. Friendship, he says, is a kind of love, but it denotes something more particular than love. It is affection in its very essence. Like Aristotle, Mishkawi places emphasis on virtue ethics in friendship, on seeking the good in oneself and in another. The friend is our alter ego. He's in total agreement with the Greek philosophers who saw in friendship not just fellowship, but a relationship which is essential to the well-being of our human souls. For him, friendship is something we need for the flourishing of human civilization, and he clarifies his own position that we cannot be moral citizens without people around us. Friendship is a context in which virtues are embodied, because our moral life struggles indeed cannot exist outside of us opening ourselves to others and cultivating virtuous relationships. Where philosophical inquiry has explored friendship, there is in general approval of friendship as being a good thing for individuals. Friendship for many today is an emotional and intellectual response to another, rather than a relationship based on belief in God. It may be deepened by a mutual belief in God, even where the understanding of God is doctrinally different, but it doesn't emerge from this. But as a Muslim, I am convinced that devotion to God does not exclude, but rather encourages the possibility of friendship with a whole range of people. This is the only way to understand and truly appreciate divine love and humanity of friendship. In our globalized world, where different cultures, races, and religions are coming together, even colliding in private and public spaces, friendship assumes a new significance. There are risks involved in the cultivation of new friendships, because every friendship has the potential to unsettle us. But a fundamental question of the modern age is, who are our friends in fragmented and divided communities? And the answer to this question will probably tell us more about ourselves than we realize, but also something about the kind of society we're creating. For some, this becomes a political question of self-identity, but for many, the ambiguity of otherness doesn't create tension, but rich opportunities of care and concern with those whom friendships may not have been possible only a few years ago. Whatever sparks off a friendship with someone who is so different in every way is sustained only because it has an inherent goodness. Neither our identities nor our religious convictions are fixed in the way we often assume they are. We are all influenced by our daily encounters, our friendships, and if we are fortunate, by occasionally meeting people whose words and actions inspire us to lead better lives. Calling ourselves Muslims and Christians or any other faith is one way to say something about who we are. But faith in God is not about silent labels. It requires words and expression. Whatever our personal convictions, human beings only learn when they engage with others, to open up new ways of thinking about things which really matter in life. This is how we grow and eventually open ourselves to receiving, but also challenging traditional wisdom. Our capacity to be both strong and vulnerable is not a weakness, but a rich paradox. An intellectual, artful dialogue is a worthy exercise, but a dialogue which touches people's hearts is a product of a generous and hospitable character. This hospitable character contains a soulful quality which is palpable while remaining impossible to measure. Let me just say something about hospitality here. Hospitality and generosity of spirit may not be the same thing, but they are part of the same virtue ethics. It is precisely because hospitality is regarded as a virtue and not as a natural instinct that it needs to be cultivated. If the ancient Greeks practiced hospitality often from fear of the gods, it soon became apparent that in the monotheistic traditions, hospitality is commanded as a divine duty, with etiquettes addressed to both the one who gives it and the one who receives it. The word stranger applies to anyone who is simply unfamiliar and to whom hospitality is owed as a religious, social, and moral duty. Recent comparative studies on hospitality often use the stories of Abraham to depict the necessity of hospitality in desert life, and where hospitality always involves an element of risk. The first story is that of Abraham and the approach of 3 strangers to his house. The 3 men are actually angels in disguise, and the story of Abraham's hospitality towards them is to be found both in Genesis 18 and Quran 51:25, although there are variations in the stories. Despite the differences between the biblical and Quranic stories, both versions speak of an Abraham compelled to show hospitality to the honored guests, whom the Quran calls the munkar, the unusual people. Hospitality is not a choice here, but a religious duty, and therefore should not be confused with contemporary understandings of charity. The second story is that of Hagar, the mother of Ismail, whom Abraham has to leave in the desert, according to some sources, because of Sarah's jealousy, and also because God commands Abraham to take Hagar and Ismail away. God has another purpose for their lives, an esteemed Arab genealogy, and a prophetic line which Muslims believe ends with Muhammad himself. Unaware of this future, as Abraham leaves Hagar, he prays to God to fill the hearts of some among men with love towards them and feed them with fruits so that they may give thanks. The concept of hospitality exists, therefore, between human beings and between man and God. Thus, it is said, a house in which no guest enters is not visited by angels, because simply put, God does not like those who do not show hospitality. As human beings, we do not know how God reflects his own hospitality, but we can try to articulate in the same way that we recognize hospitality between human beings. For the Arabs in particular, hospitality is an ancient concept, a humanizing element involving both guest and host. As Miriam Schulman and Amal Barkouki Winter explain the important role that hospitality plays in the harsh environment of the Arab world. The virtue seems an ineluctable product of the landscape. To refuse a man refreshment in such a place, that is a desert, is to let him die. To threaten the open-handedness nomadic people must depend on it to survive. So hospitality is not just a social act, it is a moral imperative. The offering of food and shelter, the very basics to survival, appear to be part of the virtue ethics of Semitic civilizations, and, as Apinar writes of the Arabs, linked closely with honor and chivalry, hospitality was considered an act of unconditional surrender to the needs of others. Islam accepted this heritage at its very inception. Indeed, throughout much of Islamic literature and poetry, God is portrayed as a guest for whose one visit one must be always prepared. This is because a visit by a stranger offers the opportunity to transform rancor and anger. In showing hospitality, humankind is given an opportunity to give and to receive, for the stranger is not a friend and may be sent to try our faith in God. God does not reveal himself in Islam, but God is present in our encounter with one another. While the traditions on hospitality focus mainly on providing material hospitality, this very act has an emotional and psychological effect on the giver and the recipient, and can thus transform the relationship between two strangers. One could, of course, argue that the desert analogy does not work with 21st century Britain, because strangers do not pass by our houses in search or hope for food or water. But just as we were to offer hospitality to the stranger in the desert, so we should rethink to whom we can extend a hand of friendship today. The divine command to be hospitable remains despite changing circumstances. It is true that some would argue that there are practical differences, dietary and other differences, which might limit possibilities. Most people feel comfortable with those who eat and drink and socialize in the same way. For example, if alcohol is an impediment to social relations, then social relations will be limited. If gender segregation is the emergent framework among some Muslim communities as a basis for social gatherings, then this too may be limiting. One could argue that adult socializing has a way of filtering its preferences, and contrived settings may not be conducive to developing friendships across cultures and backgrounds. We cannot force friendships any more than we can force love, but we can think more meaningfully about the kind of relationships we develop with those around us. A more basic question might even be whether civil society even needs intercultural friendships for human flourishing. But as the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur saw it, hospitality was a form of hermeneutical openness, challenging growing tendencies of closure, isolationism, and exclusivism. So it's precisely because hospitality and friendship involve risk, take us away from the comfort of religious convictions, even demand from us making difficult choices about relationships, that such relationships matter. This is why words such as integration must be reimagined beyond bland political narratives. Unless there is a sense of belonging, a sense of home which we share with everyone, many will feel outsiders or nationals who belong simply to only one community. Hospitality isn't just about sharing food, it's essentially a way of being, a way of talking, and a way of conducting oneself. If a friendship unsettles us, it ultimately opens us to thinking about who we are as people. As the writer Anais Nin wrote, each friend represents a world in us, a world possibly not born until they arrive, and it is only by this meeting that a new world is born. So, hospitality and friendship rely on shared lives and mutual experiences. They are shaped by the personal, the social, and the political. And it seems to me that whether we consider friendships conceptually or structurally, friendships are good for society, not just good for the individual, because they do bring a distinct moral good to us as individuals. Categories of friendship are implicit in many of the central sociological and ethical questions of today, and have a stake in defining who we are as individuals, and perhaps more importantly, who we are as communities in a multiracial, multi-faith, and multicultural environment. The modern age is defined by a process of migration and renewed interest in identity formation. Who we choose to have as friends matters and says something about our cultural attitude as well as our cultural preferences. Just to conclude, there is no return to a pre-multicultural society or another home. For many Muslims, the UK is the only home they know. The essential question for many across the generations is that within the context of civil society, how do Muslims see their engagement as minorities and majority citizens, and what resources do they draw upon? Will the human experience of simply living and working with different people and cultures be the necessary factor in determining how pluralism will develop? For many Muslims and Islamic states, this is about replacing the division of the world into the world of Islam and the world of the unbeliever by a world for all. It is about understanding that if diversity in all manners is truly God's will and blessing on earth, it has to be accepted intellectually and emotionally in real terms. This kind of commitment to diversity must make theological and political space for the other and other ways of living and being, whatever the differences. Unless we get rid of dogmatism and prejudice and empathize with human diversity at a local, national, and global level, most Muslim societies will remain silent observers or ineffective players in the whole project of diminishing Muslim otherness in the West. The question is whether they wish to do this in the first place, and if not, what is the distinctiveness of Islam that many wish to bring? We cannot take our peaceful coexistence for granted, and all of us must find imaginative ways of strengthening human social bonds. We are not here simply to survive. If we agree that human beings are social animals who deliberately look for social relations, then we cannot stress enough the importance of friendship, because friendship demands reciprocity and a shared loyalty to the life of a civic community, and hopefully the creation of a more generous society. To find God in the friendships we form may theoretically become a major primary determinant of who we choose as friends and whose friends we choose to become. But it seems to me that for most of us, a true friendship does not emerge or become deeper based on such factors. Those who have faith in God see God working through all their friendships. When we stand in the presence of another person, we have a moral choice to make: extending our hand or turning away, hope of receiving and giving the gift of friendship. So let me end with one of my favorite writers, Ralph Emerson, who said, "When a man becomes dear to me, I have touched the goal of fortune." To feel transformed in this remarkable way requires an openness and generosity of spirit, which I think far exceeds the boundaries so often set by religious discourse. Thank you.